In the United States, as elsewhere, the war whetted the appetites of bankers and industrialists. The U.S. economy was expanding rapidly in 1914, but it wasn't yet internationally dominant. The First World War helped it to consolidate, while in the meantime, weakening its competitors. With the conquest of new markets abroad, the U.S. was soon in a position to crush its rivals. In the U.S., savvy businessmen know that it is better to sell shovels to prospectors than to dig for gold oneself. $2 billion worth of material had already been sold to their allies before they entered the war in 1917. In the French paper Les Annales, the journalist Camille Ferry-Pisani quotes an important and influential American banker in his article on March 25, 1917. The war enabled us to quintuple our profits. We got rich by providing cotton, wool, meat, steel, artillery shells, wheat, leather, shoes, machine guns, horses, and automobiles. Anything we could sell, you bought. You paid with gold, with paper currency, with bonds, and with loans. So you must win the war at all costs in order to pay us back. Then the money we have made by these sales will be lent to you again to rebuild your cities and factories. But we will only profit if you win. That is why we want you to win rapidly. The sinking of the ocean liner Lusitania by a German submarine on May 7, 1915, offered the United States the pretext they needed to enter the war. The incident was presented to the American public as a war crime and became a major argument in persuading the U.S. to go to war against Germany. The Germans claimed that the ship was transporting munitions for the Allies. This claim that the Lusitania was carrying American ammunitions was confirmed by historians years later, in 1972. President Woodrow Wilson declared that some countries are simply too proud to fight. But he swallowed his pride and led the U.S. into the war in April 1917. He then asserted that the United States should be willing to sacrifice lives in the name of its founding principles. The president was more discreet about the $2 billion lent to the Allies, a debt that would never be repaid if the Germans, with their submarines, won the war. In 1917, the war led to the revolution in Russia. "10 days that shook the world. There was a new feeling that the oppressed, the downtrodden could make the world a better place. Russia pulled out of the war, thus freeing up the German army in the east and putting a possible victory within their grasp." The United States had no choice but to intervene in order to protect their best interests. But fighting a war in faraway Europe was an idea that would have to be sold to the American public. Despite the indignation provoked by the sinking of the Lusitania, most young Americans weren't ready to die overseas for a matter of principles. In order to convince them, President Wilson made eloquent speeches. He spoke about a war to end all wars and making the world safe for democracy. Out of 4 million American soldiers mobilized, 2 million were sent to the front. 116,000 of them would never return. In this elementary school in Chicago, you see children throwing down German books in front of the camera. The journalist George Creel became the official head of propaganda for the Committee on Public Information. He launched the operation 4-Minute Men. It consisted in sending out accomplished public speakers ready to intervene anywhere at a moment's notice to make persuasive 4-minute speeches. Creel mobilized 75,000 orators who made 750,000 speeches in over 5,000 towns and cities across the U.S. to convince the public. This is Douglas Fairbanks. This is Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was called into service to sell Liberty bonds in order to support the war effort. I want you for U.S. Army. Despite the unprecedented propaganda, very few young people in the U.S. volunteered and recruitment was disappointing. So, the government decided to institute the draft. The opposition to the war had to be silenced. The Espionage Act, a law ostensibly against espionage, enabled the authorities to imprison anyone who wrote or spoke against the war for up to 20 years. Union activists were the first victims. Emma Goldman, Zinne's heroine, took part in anti-war meetings all over the country and helped organize the No Conscription League to oppose the draft. She and her companion, Alexander Berkman, were arrested. They were then imprisoned on Ellis Island and deported back to Russia, their country of origin, on December 21st, 1919. Socialist leader Eugene Debs would also be silenced by the Espionage Act. His political career was brought to a halt in June 1918. He was arrested in Canton, Ohio after giving an anti-war speech to an audience that included young men of draft age. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for obstructing the recruitment and enlistment service. But Debs ran for president in 1920 from his prison cell and received almost 1 million votes. Chris Hedges is a journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner and a former war correspondent for the New York Times. He ended up resigning from the paper because he didn't agree with their editorial policy. He has investigated the part played by the elites during the First World War and the role of George Creel, the chief organizer of war propaganda.
Creel was created to destroy Debs. And what was created, and I take this from Dwight McDonnell's observation, is the imposition of the psychosis of permanent war. You are constantly keeping a population in fear, and you, in the name of the war on communism, you destroy your populist and your radical movements and disembowel your liberal class.
You're saying that in 1917, that's when propaganda was invented, when modern advertising was invented.
Yes, because it was the first system of modern mass propaganda, because it employed the understanding of crowd psychology pioneered by Le Bon, Trotter, Freud, which grasped that people were moved not by fact or reason, but by the skillful manipulation of emotion. And that system of mass propaganda is the model that Goebbels uses when he creates the Nazi propaganda machine. And quite specifically, Bernay's book, Propaganda. And when you read the great radical thinkers of the period, Randolph Bourne or Jane Addams, they despair that not only have the masses been seduced by this propaganda, but most of the intellectual elite as well. So the moment the war is over, that entire machinery, which was massive, goes to Madison Avenue and starts working on behalf of corporations. That's when you overturn traditional values of thrift, self-effacement, and you replace them with consumption as a kind of inner compulsion and the cult of the self.
1917, c'est aussi la révolution bolchevique.
1917 is also the year of the Russian Revolution. And you're saying they went from the Kraut to the Commie.
Yes, and of course, that is correct, that instantly the dreaded Hun becomes the dreaded Red, and the way they do it is to claim that the Germans were behind, the Kaiser was behind Lenin's arrival because the train was allowed passage through Germany from Switzerland, and so they recognize, the ruling elite recognizes that apparatus of propaganda, fear, and permanent war is one that can keep them in power, which is why the moment the Cold War is over, we begin the war on terror, because it serves the same purpose. And they recognize that if they perpetuate that propaganda, that fear, and permanent war, they can get the masses to call for their own enslavement, which is precisely what's happened.
They manufactured a will of the people for a very short time, right after the war started, as governments are able to do right after the beginning of an armed conflict. They're able to create an atmosphere of war hysteria. And so for a short time, they had captivated the minds of the American people.
The rabbits, who didn't have historians and who knew nothing of their own history, didn't say anything when the hunters arrived with their big guns. "We're here for your security," the hunters told them. "We're here to protect you from the terrorist rabbits, from the communist rabbits, from the Jewish rabbits, from the Muslim rabbits, from the perverted rabbits, from those who want to cook rabbit stew." The terrified rabbits, paralyzed in the hunters' headlights, huddled together. "There's nothing to be afraid of," the hunters told them. "You'll be free once you're in the cages. And don't let our big guns scare you. If you want peace, you must prepare war. War against the bad guys. A just war. War is peace." What Howard Zinn has to say is, the power of the hunters depends on the obedience of the rabbits.